Well, good afternoon everyone, and a special hi to those online. Welcome to week 11, I believe. Later today, in the second half, Dan will be speaking about the final essay and some assistance that we're only too eager to share with you and support you for its due date, the 3rd of June. Last week, and I've had some lovely correspondence from students. Thank you those online and one or two of our students here on campus. Because I finished last week that long sweep of history with on an optimistic note. Or in theology, it's not good to talk about optimistic, it's more theologically, it's better to talk about a hope-filled finish with Vatican II, which was finally the Church's response to what Pope John Paul would later call the century of death. That First World War, Second World War, and they were world wars, and then not long after the Second World War, there was all the colonial disputation between colonial powers who thought they could come back, like the Dutch, and reclaim what we know today as Indonesia, or the French who thought they could go back and reclaim Vietnam. And that, of course, was duplicated right through Africa, South America. So they were the fruits of the 20th century, and of course I touched on the philosophy of Hegel, which gave a foundation to Marx and Engels, and then of course that developed into Marxism, communism, socialism, National Socialism, and the Bolshevik revolutions. And of course the 1950s, of course, we had the Cold War, a nuclear standoff. So where did that leave the most significant Christian church in European history? The Roman Catholic Church maintained a structure of the Pope and the bishop priests, and of course the laity at the bottom of our pyramid. This consistent through history and through the lectures. Vatican II didn't exactly turn everything upside down, but in a significant way it did place itself as an ecumenical council, a universal council, there at the top of the pyramid during those years, 62 to 65. The second stage there, it wasn't so much that the Pope was brought down to the level of the bishops. It was really, the important word is the and. The relationship between the Pope and the bishops. Best summed up in the concepts of collegiality and subsidiarity. Ecclesiology, the college of bishops and with the Pope, and subsidiarity, that decisions are made at the appropriate level. Summed up even more apostolically, you would understand it as no Peter without the 11, no 11 without Peter. So that was where Vatican II situated the hierarchical church. And the documents reflect that, particularly we'll be discussing two of them in the first 40 minutes today. The laity, and interestingly, the priests were seen together, though there was a great deal of Vatican II, a great deal of the work at Vatican II was situating the laity through their baptismal priesthood, but even the sacramental priesthood within the Roman Catholic Church was seen as the laity and the priests working in collaboration. Interestingly, carrying on the theme of church history, as I finish with the words, Vatican II created then this Aristotelian whirlpool where you had the bishops and Pope, the people of God, who, because it was an ecumenical council, I can put that there in a little bubble, because you actually had people going out, representatives not of the Catholic Church, but of the Protestant churches, the Eastern Rites, the Eastern Orthodox churches, who went out from Vatican II, graced by the fact that they saw themselves, and I use that word graced purposely, graced by the recognition that they had been seen as the people of God, or as I said last week, as a pilgrim people, a people on a journey in faith. Interesting group there, just submerged. One of the faults of Vatican II was it didn't really get to the heart of what the role of future priests and religious meaning nuns, brothers and religious priests. They were just put into the mix. And just saying that, it was interesting that the laity themselves, I haven't put the word there out of respect for any connotations it's had with the history of the church, the people saw themselves there as the people of God. The role of the priests and religious within Vatican II was a story that wasn't completed. But all of them, as the pyramid has been turned upside down in that Aristotelian whirlpool, and we ended up with that simple statement that the church saw itself in the world. More than just in the world but not of the world, as Pauline theology would have it, but simply the church as popes, bishops, people of God in the world. And interestingly enough, the popes themselves, Paul was 6, John Paul was 2, John Paul I didn't have time to travel. He only was in the chair of Peter for 31 days, 32 days. But they did themselves reach out to the world and travelled. They went from being Pius IX's prisoner of the Vatican to being on the world stage, the most travelled. Paul VI, interestingly enough, did come to Australia, which as a young boy I was fascinated. I didn't see him, but he came to Melbourne and Sydney. Quite remarkable. I remember my parents and grandparents were quite moved to think that a pope in the history of the church was actually come to Australia. The church in the world. So you see that progression, that something did finally happen. The two major documents in relationship to how the church itself sees itself, or the church's own self-understanding, or ecclesiology, ecclesia, the assembly, the study of the church. The two major documents, Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes. Lumen Gentium means basically a light to all nations. Gaudium et Spes relates more to what I've just shared with you. It's the pastoral constitution of the church, and I've underlined it, in the world. Those online might just note that that underlining there is the significance. I believe they debated for some days that one word. Was it going to be the church to the world or the church in the world? The significance of language again, one single word. I've only put that major text, the first section, the opening paragraph of Gaudium Spes, because it's worth a read. It's beautiful.
Is there a special reason that and women is in brackets each time?
Yes, the translation I used was from the Vatican archives, the current Vatican archives, the English, where they only use men. And they use mankind too, I should. But as students, we become used to exclusive language, church documents, political manifestos. I thought that debate was over, but no. Assignments beware, essays beware. What's it saying? The joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of this age. It basically sums up what I was inferring, is that however hard you use Hegel or any concept to bring around, if you go from a thesis to move to an antithesis and move to a synthesis, you are still left with people who have joys and hopes, but also griefs and anxieties. But particularly the poor, who are afflicted in any way, not just materially. These should be the joys and hopes and griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. Our hearts should burn within us. Its emphasis on the spirit in their journey to the kingdom. And significant for all future church teachings. This is meant for everyone. And Hegel would be proud, and Marx particularly. This is why this community realises that it is truly linked. It's not separate from humanity, humankind. It's not separated from its history by the depth of these bonds. A beautiful statement, basically summing up where the church was by the middle of the 1960s. You could hear some echoes there of Hegel. I was confident that I've highlighted this in white for those online, that philosophy could penetrate deep into the true nature of absolute being, not as a substance or an incarnation, but as a process. We're followers of Christ. We are in progress, in a process. Before we had the people of God seeing themselves as a pilgrim people, a people on a journey, in a process. And also, Hegel held Christianity in high esteem since it was a religion of the human spirit. Christianity's great claim in its own Trinitarian theology of a God as being Father, Son, and this presence of the Holy Spirit on this journey. So Hegel would have sat there between 1962 and 65, and his esteem for Christianity at its best, which I still think it was, that remarkable meeting of humanity, north, south, east and west, called Vatican II, I myself see as a high point. And those of us who study in depth the understanding of the church still see it as, well, most authoritative statements we have in the church is a general assembly, a general council, I should say. So there we have it again. The church at its sacred core was told to go out to the world, to be there with the sadnesses, the joys, and the anxieties. We live in a time of anxiety. Well, in Australia we're more like a time of whinging, but underneath that whinging, every piece of anxiety. What's happened over the last 50 years? Hard to believe 50 years is a time for students of church, students of theology and the social sciences to actually look at an institution like the Catholic Church and say, well, what has happened to that vision of Vatican II? What's happened to those two pillars of the church? On top of all the other documents on ecumenism and interfaith relations. The Vatican Council, for those years, had that structure, put the Pope and the bishops in dialogue with each other, put the laity and priests working together. And it can be summed up as a priest shared with me only the other week when I rang him for some advice on how to present Vatican II at university level. He said, Mike, I'd like the students to hear that Vatican II had a vision. Sadly, the popes, even on that venture, on that plane out from the Vatican, travelling the world, particularly Pope John Paul II, he did have his own agenda. But that should not surprise us. Every pope has. Simon Peter had an agenda. The current pope, we will be studying in some detail, will actually see the foundations of his agenda. Sadly, the cardinals and the bishops, as they have always, colluded. I asked the priest, why did he use the word collude? And he said it's one of those lovely English words that sound like it is. They had the weight of all this expectation on them. We all know what the weight of expectation is. Either history maketh the man or the clothes maketh the man or woman. They've had incredible pressure on them. Every issue you want to raise, from financial governance to theological college, the pressure has been there for them. What did the people of God, particularly the priests, religious, and the people of God, the laity, priests and religious, did come together in almost a Catholic spring. As if Aristotle had his way, the funnel, the whirlpool became unplugged. Not only did we go out to the world, but interestingly enough, an argument can be placed by church historians that the people of God, particularly in relationship to the Roman Church in the developed world, has actually left the church in numbers. Significant for the mainstream Christian churches as well. Now, there has been areas in the developing world where the people being baptised or people involved in church activity has grown. There are areas of the Pentecostal churches that are growing even in the developing world, particularly in places like Australia and the United States. But the end result is still a statement of history, and Marx would say this has been a natural march, a revolution in the church. And particularly you could understand young people saying, well, it's all too busy, I'm not involved with the church. But the church has basically lost a substantial amount of its significant men and women, its priests and religious. Again, there have been pockets of future development, but the more and more I read, or I've shared with Dan that I've given up reading current news on the church. It was just all too depressing there for a while, but next week I'll probably find myself reading an article again. But it's a sad point. But for yourselves in this study, I want to end on an optimistic fruit. Liberation theology has its roots from Vatican II, but interestingly, it was Vatican II that asked us to discern the sign of the times in the light of the gospel. To discern the sign of the times in the light of the gospels. Liberation theology went back a bit further. It's a great debate amongst Hebrew scholars and scripture scholars. Actually, when you do an introduction to the Old Testament, the First Testament Hebrew scriptures, whether you start with the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus, I always love hearing two scripture scholars argue the toss. In America, you'll know whether they went to a Jesuit seminary or Jesuit theological college, they'll always start with the book of Exodus. Exodus, the Hebrew people being led by Moses from slavery in Egypt. So there was a liberation from slavery, but interestingly enough, a slavery of the oppressor and the slavery of one's own making. There's an echo here again of Marx, is the master-slave relationship. Is that time when they, with a bit of help from liberating characters of history like Moses, to actually demand of the people to realise what Hegel and Marx were on about, was that the slave suddenly has this realisation that the master needs them more than they need the master. It's, in psychology, there's a real self-affirmation of a person's role in life. But the sadness is that we tend to want the status quo, and we can find ourselves in slavery, in mortgages, in career paths of sadness, saying, oh, well, this is my lot in my life. And we actually learn to despise our potential, or at least not even approach our potential. Very interesting area indeed. Liberation theology tackled the lot. If you wanted to know where a post-colonial world was stressed, the anxieties of people like Peruvian Gustavo Gutierrez, he knew the pain of the whole Americas. I always like listening or reading them. They refer to the Americas, which is South America and North America. Pope John Paul II, Caravaggio, on his overseas tours, always referred to the Americas. It used to upset the American State Department, the CIA. The Americas from Alaska, Canada, North America, right down through. He was purposely chided by it. Gutierrez's major work, he dared to put, reflecting on the Vatican documents, a theology of liberation. And he answered the interesting side here, the critical reflection on praxis, on what actually the church does, not exactly what it says. Or even more importantly, a good study from people like Terry Valings in the area of practical theology. Orthodoxy doesn't come from what you say, it comes from what you practice, or orthopractice. A very challenging insight that practical theology or pastoral theology gives to anybody wanting to test orthodoxy within any Christian, I presume, any faith. Critiqued again by people who in letters to the editor will continue to say, I wish the church practices what they preach. You know, those glib throwaway lines. Gutierrez took it more seriously because he took Marx seriously, because the philosophies and the engagement is an ongoing commitment to political action and practice. And I'm not just throwing those together because it looks cute. Or we could go back and ask you, that would be a good actual assignment, to actually ask people to read the Theology of Liberation and actually see which sections of Vatican II Gutierrez uses. But significantly, on top of all that history we had last week that brought us to the conflicts of ideologies and isms, Marxist philosophy is an ongoing commitment to political action or practice. Marx would demand that more than he would see religion as purely the opium of the people. The church itself can take a leaf out, as Gutierrez did. And this were remarkable because the 5 themes that arose is that the church has a role in a prophetic denunciation of injustice within Latin American societies. Latin America being his local theological setting. A beautiful word here, related to the whole area of formation of conscience, the need for conscientising evangelisation. Again, discerning the signs of the time in the light of the Gospels and the social liberation that's contained in those Gospels. A call to evangelise evangelical poverty, a little pious, I granted, but not pious when you think of solidarity with the poor, summed up by some, live simply so others may simply live, a direct challenge to the developed world. Or I should have typed this up here for you for a future Google search, is a preferential option for the poor. But I'll go to the word solidarity there, being one with the poor. That's not patronising of the poor, because we all know that you'll have stories of in areas of greatest physical poverty, you will find people of spirit, where in lands of great wealth and affluence, Kath and Kim, you know, I want to be affluent. Yes, you are affluent. Again, I'm saying it's not patronising. The economists could walk in and we could line them up against the wall there, and they would have to admit at the end of the day the great deal of the wealth of the developed world is because of the poverty of the developing world. I'll repeat that. The wealth of the developed world. And the story I always tell, it's a figure from an ABC program, the science show, that here in this room I have a mobile phone, I have 3 computers. Yeah, I presume I could use that phone there. Hands up how many mobile phones in this room. That's very good, isn't it? Half the world has never made a phone call. Half the people of the world have never made a phone call. Am I asking you to beat yourself up over that? Yes. Because particularly those of us who have associations with churches, where the young and the not so young says, I wish the church would practice what it preaches. For all the above, the church needs, Gutierrez says, to look at itself and its structures and its pastoral strategies. For Gutierrez, this had a particular significance for the lifestyle of the bishops, priests, and the whole universal church. It's a good summary there in a Neo-THOMISM book on introducing theologies. Liberation theology theologizes about the social reality. It does not claim to have direct access to this reality, but seeks to help of social sciences to clarify and to systematise the social order. This is a remarkable opening steps as early as the 1970s, where the church, in a small way, thanks to liberation theology, found a way where it could engage with the social sciences. The fruits of that is we're standing here today. And when you're called into the marketplace of ideas, such as a public university where theology should be always there, open, in the marketplace of ideas, we ourselves are also, within the social sciences, we can appreciate, Omerod says, and it was fascinating. Neil, as a leading Australian Catholic theologian, and I knew him as a young man, he never really saw much hope of the relationship between theology and the social sciences. But here, in the late part of the 20th century, 1997, I see a glimmer. Of course, he always used the polarities to emphasise a fact, but he could name, and this is the beauty of a lot of the theology of Vatican II, is that in the last 50 years we're able to join with others and look at the functionalists based on the metaphor of the hierarchy, of our Platonic understanding of the hierarchies. But we could also look at things like Marxism, standing on the shoulders of Hegel, and take seriously the conflict rule, which sees society in terms of struggle between competing groups. It's not resting the case in the struggle, because we saw last week the struggle, more often than not, ends up in war and sadness. But liberation theology has been criticised, and it always fascinates me why. Well, it shouldn't fascinate me, really. The left always has to justify itself. The right can do anything, except on the judgment day of history. Liberation theology has been criticised, and one of the most damning critiques came from the Roman Church, and very early, only some 10, 11, 12 years after Gutierrez wrote his works. The Sacred Congregation, the Doctrine of the Faith, its predecessor was the Propaganda, and the predecessor of that was the Inquisition. A little bit of track record in naming things, and God loved them for it. And the man who wrote this, you'll be hearing about some more. He makes this claim as prefect for the congregation. By the way, he'd only been prefect for 3 years, I just noticed. Once I'll name it, make use of any Marxist concept, one is necessarily led to adopting all of Marxism. Bit of a straw man argument, this. Get used to it. Which is, and he names them, materialistic. For us online there, I've just put a little bracket there. No spiritual dimension to the human life. A great deal of what I said last week in relationship to Marx and Hegel is dismissed, particularly by English philosophers, as just pure materialistic. Atheistic, no God. Well, I've had great dealings with atheists. I still get more concerned with theists, but an interesting sidelight. And deterministic. This is an interesting insight. No freedom, meaning that every choice and action is necessitated by other choices and actions, therefore no choice or action is free. Again, I put that up there for you to show how the church itself can respond to history in a quite authoritative way, but that authority also needs to be put under the microscope and asked, what does it really mean? Well, it didn't stop the search, particularly in places like South America and amongst religious women priests dealing with the indigenous peoples of even countries like Australia. But during the 1980s, many remarkable priests, church workers, nurses, doctors were killed in places like Central America during those many post-colonial conflicts. These martyrs included a remarkable man, Oscar Romero, who was shot in only 9 years after Gutierrez wrote his work, and 6 priests and the housekeepers. Always correct Jesuit friends about that. This brought into stark focus the whole relationship of those, the followers of Christ. Though what has happened, and it's not the first time this happened to documents that came from the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith, the hand of John Paul II, Karol Wojtyla, particularly I suspect with his history of Central Europe, particularly being Polish, he helped, or he might have asked the congregation and its author to just add a few closing paragraphs, which was his wont as Pope. And he offered us, at the end, the Church of the Poor throughout the world intends to come to the aid of the noble struggle for truth and justice. She addresses each person, and for that reason, every person. She is the universal church, the church of the incarnation. She is not the church of one class or the other, and she speaks in the same name of truth itself. This truth is realistic. I like that. It leads to recognition of every human reality, every injustice, every tension, every struggle. So it took some years, but that is still a little answer back from the church, having 2 bob each way. But significantly for me, it draws that relationship into focus even more. And those 2 famous images, as was pointed out to me by an art student one day, that the star that Che Guevara wears, over the years, that's one of the most duplicated prints, as we know, in the world. But over the years, on T-shirts and that, the star's actually become more like a white dove. Interesting how art doesn't let you to control the situation. Never trust art. There's a truth there in that image. There's a truth there in those eyes. And back here in Australia, if we need just a little bit of local theology, remembering Australia has been the promised land for so many, even though Norway has gone through such fascinating but sad times recently, looking at its own inner soul. And so it must be, while the world goes rolling round its course, the warning pen shall write in vain, the warning voice grows hoarse. For not until the city feels red revolution's feet shall its sad people miss a while the terrors of the street, the dreadful everlasting strife for scarcely clothes or meat. In the pent track of living death, the city's cruel street. Henry's summing up of the streets of Sydney, the turn of the 19th and 20th century. But to close, there was another group of faces in the street, and they were a fascinating group because, returning to the book of Exodus, Moses, when he actually asked the people to confront their slavery, to confront their oppression, Their response to him, and it's worth a read, the whole chapter 16, to see the context. But these three famous lines from this remarkable book of Exodus. Why did we not die at the Lord's hands in Egypt, where we used to sit around the flesh pots and could eat to our heart's content? As it is, you have led us into the desert to starve this entire assembly church to death. The Hebrew slaves much preferred the pent-up anger, the closed narrowness of that little Egyptian village to that horizon, that promised land, over that horizon. So the Exodus story is a telling story in what we do ourselves over the next little while as we face the social consequences. But I thought it was worthwhile for you to see that in context. I heard one of you have already read some liberation theology. It's a never-ending. It's a work course. What was the phrase I'm looking for? It's a work in progress because the struggle keeps going. Or I'll defer to my learned colleagues to my right, your left, to take up now. Or
yeah, we'll just kick into the next bit. We'll go to YouTube. Probably take 7 or 8 minutes from now, and then we'll have a break. Okay. Theologically, one of the most interesting things that happened in the 20th century was a NEO-THOMIST, as it's called, revival. One of a number of revivals of Aquinas' thought. I think we've kind of come to see, there have been a few aha moments along the way where, and I've seen it in your discussion board items and I've heard it in here, saying, so why didn't they hear Aquinas? A lot of these troubles could have been solved. A lot of the Protestant Reformation mightn't have happened the way it did. A lot of all sorts of things probably wouldn't have happened the way it did if the churches had just understood Aquinas. East and West might have come back together by the 13th century if people had understood where Aquinas was at. Just to preface it, there is a bit of a stereotype around, that Catholics talk Aquinas and Protestants talk Barth or whatever. We've heard it even around here quite recently, with Aquinas sort of referred to as a papist or whatever. I think a square reading of theology requires avoiding that kind of stereotyping. And I'm a bit of a case in point. I mean, I learned nothing, I could say, virtually nothing, surprisingly, about Aquinas through Catholic sources. I learned virtually nothing about Aquinas when I did my own Bachelor of Theology. It just wasn't in vogue in either Protestant or Catholic circles. The penny for me dropped about Aquinas probably heavily through two sources, one being Bertrand Russell, an atheist philosopher, who just picked where he fitted in. Wasn't at all in awe of him, wasn't a particular fan of his, but in fact Russell wasn't a fan of anybody. Russell gives a pretty rough account of virtually everybody. But he picked exactly where Aquinas sort of fitted into the stream of thought, and clearly as one of those kind of touchstone characters, I suppose. It just pops up once, every 1,000 years or so. And the other was actually through my postgraduate study of Bonhoeffer and looking at the various sources that had influenced Bonhoeffer, who of course was as Protestant as it comes. So I've come to Aquinas personally through a most unstereotypical kind of a route. And I think it actually sharpens my own sense of how important he is, that it wasn't something that in any way I was indoctrinated into. It sort of came as a, for me as a fairly mature scholar, if indeed I am a mature scholar. There's been, interestingly, two major Thomist revivals. Second of these particularly pertinent to everything that Mike's been talking about, to the whole way in which Vatican II happened. One, very early on, there was actually a Thomist revival happening around about the same time as the Protestant Reformation was happening. And then the second one in the 20th century. And interestingly, and again against the stereotype totally, they're both Catholic and Protestant. Some of the Protestant reformers, not the ones we tend to hear about, not the Luthers, not the Calvins, but some of the Protestant reformers actually knew Aquinas way, way better than the Catholic Church at the time. And they were trying to see a way in which Aquinas could be used to resolve a lot of the conflicts that were going on. So, yeah, I might just come back to that. I'll just finish the 16th, 17th century bit, and then we'll be ready to sort of launch into the 20th century. These two, Cajetan and Vittoria, they're two of the people who actually within the Catholic world were as appalled at what was going on with the Roman Church as Luther and co. Absolutely as appalled at, the behaviour of an Alexander VI. We get all upset about Craig Thompson and all that sort of stuff. I can tell you he's a lily white little angel compared to what Alexander VI, as Pope, was up to. And people like Cajetan and Vittoria, as disgusted as anybody, and indeed their disgust, their disillusionment with the church and with the papacy and with the whole pyramidical structure led them to an intense scholarship of Aquinas, searching for another paradigm, another way in which this whole Christian experience could be expressed that doesn't lead to the debauchery of Pope Alexander VI. But, around about the same time, or, a little bit later, more or less when the Protestant Reformation's happening, very, very early days of it, in the Lutheran establishment, the very fledgling Lutheran establishment, you've got characters like John Gerard and Emilio Dorsch. They're both German Lutherans, and strictly so, but they see what Luther misses. I remember when we were doing the Luther stuff, you think, God, why didn't Luther... the perfect character was there, the perfect thinking was there to resolve his issues. Why did he go back to Augustine, for God's sake? Why didn't he go to... Well, there were Lutherans, not as prominent. They didn't capture the crowd in the same way, partly because they were trying to find the middle ground, where Luther in the end just said, up the lot of you kind of thing, I'm going off, breaking totally away, and that's of course then when Zwingli and Knox all go as far away as they can from the Roman model. But you've got in the middle ground Lutherans like Gerhard and Dorsch trying to kind of reconcile the two sides, the Roman and the Protestant sides, and using Aquinas. And one of Dorsch's most famous phrases is, he thinks Aquinas, if he was alive today, would be on our side. And frankly, I think he's right. I'm quite sure that Aquinas, living a couple of centuries later, would have had to side with the Protestants, because morally at the time. There was probably little choice. And he could see a whole lot of complementary kind of thinking between Aquinas and the goals of the Lutheran Revolution. And then you got some very interesting Calvinist into Anglican types. Vermigli, otherwise known as Peter Martyr, he moves, he shops around. He starts as Catholic and then he goes all the way over to hard Calvinist, and he spends some time over with Cranmer in England, and, and then he goes back and finishes off in Strasbourg. Really searching for the answers. The most persistent thing he carries with him, though, is his understanding of Thomas Aquinas. And all the time he is looking to apply this thinking that he rightly sees as quite revolutionary, and indeed as offering a whole lot of answers to what the Reformation was on about. Answers that he doesn't see coming through at all in the end in most of the Protestantisms that he's associated with. So he re-emphasises that theology is a science required to understand revelation. He's not at all taken with this typical Protestant notion that we've got the Bible and all we've got to do is open the book and there's God speaking to us. He's not at all one for replacing the Pope at the top of the pyramid with the Bible. He predicts that that's going to create just as many troubles down the track, because for a start we're moving into a scientific era that's not going to accept either of them. Quite a prophetic kind of a character, but again a bit too ponderous and a bit too profound to be the sort of populist that John Knox was, for instance. Knox thought in 3-word sentences, and 2-syllable words. I mean, it was all he'd have been a great politician today, the soundbite kind of reformer. Whereas Vermigli was, deep and ponderous, and that's what studying Aquinas tends to do to you. And so he rejects a whole lot of the radical Protestantism, including some of the elements that he sees forming in the English church. He actually, in the end, has quite an influence on Cranmer in forming a sort of a middle-of-the-road English church. He's part of the reason. He's probably the more significant than Cranmer in the way in which the Church of England ends up turning out as that sort of middle-of-the-road, is it Protestant, is it Catholic? Some Anglicans think this, some Anglicans think that. The great spread of Anglicanisms from heavy Calvinist Protestantism to something that's more Catholic than the Catholics have ever dreamt up. He's probably responsible for a lot of that. And then Zanchi, Girolamo of Zanchi, he uses Aquinas to show the consistency between Thomism and Protestantism, and very, very interestingly uses Aquinas to open up all the old debates that the Reformation didn't open up. The debates that Aquinas had tried to open up in the 13th century, to go back and 1,000 years later, let's have a look at Nicaea, let's have a look at Arius, a whole lot of unfinished business there that ultimately led to the great splits between East and West, and the formulations that have come out of Nicaea and Chalcedon and co. They're just not going to endure. They're not going to carry Christianity forward. At some point, we've got to have another look at those. And he uses Aquinas to open all of that up again, and becomes effectively like a pork chop in a synagogue as a Protestant. There's just no way in the world that the reformers want to open that can of worms, or even see the need to, which actually shows how, at one level, theologically deprived the whole shebang was, Catholic or Protestant, at the time, except for these scholarly types on the edges trying to control a thought that was just going absolutely ape, because that's where people were. They were all upset and wanting to burn popes and burn this and burn that, and not many people were thinking straight. These guys were, and they were using Thomism to do it. So that's kind of, a little bit of a bridge between what was happening around the Reformation and then into the 17th century, into that Enlightenment period. And then Aquinas kind of gets pretty well lost anywhere, Catholic or Protestant, and then kind of pops out again towards the end of the late 19th century and into the 20th century. But might just have 5 minutes looking at, I think, a nice little piece from Karen Kilby, who you might come across in your reading. She'd be one of the leading theologians, biblical theologians and systematicians in the world today. An outstanding lady at the University of Nottingham. No, I studied that one, yeah. Oh, you're right. No, it's not Kilby, sorry. Yep. Sorry, Kilby's on later. This is Simon Oliver. You can find it. It's in your notes. I mean, you get a bit of a clue there as to why the raging reformers didn't use him. He's talking about mysteries. He's saying that we don't have a handle on God. Their message was, we do. It's in the Bible. That's all we need. And we can use the Bible and the truth coming out of the Bible to knock this Pope off his perch. They didn't want anything, that was as subtle as what Aquinas was on about, although ultimately, as some of these other reformers, I think, show quite nicely, subtlety, a sense of mystery, a sense of other, the fact that we don't have a handle on God in the way that the Roman Church was, what's the word? Taking for granted at the time. Actually, could have been a much more powerful way of tempering what the Roman Church was doing. A way that would have endured, and a way that would have, because of his, deep scientific, philosophical, legal kind of perspective on things, would have actually carried Christianity much more comfortably through the Enlightenment that was about to hit than what happened. But there you go. Can't re-pick history. Okay, let's just take 5 minutes and we'll just come back quickly and look at the 20th century version of this, and then. Yep. Okay, we might kick in. These two characters, by the way, are Italian reformers, Italian Protestants, if you like. You don't hear much about them in the mainstream Reformation literature, but and least of all from the Catholic Church. But they were actually, in a sense, more of a threat to the Roman Church than the likes of Luther and Knox, because the Church could always say, well, what they're really upset about is, the nationalist agenda, that it's not really anything to do with us. But it was the ones from within, especially high-ranking scholarly types, people who'd been very much within the Church, and the difficulties of being an Italian reformer you couldn't possibly overestimate. They really took their life in their hands. But yeah, they're a very, very important part of the mix, and obviously very well versed in Aquinas, unlike so many of the reformers. So 20th century Neo-Thomism, again, all of those events of the 19th century, the Enlightenment, the Church goes back to search out its own tradition to see where some of the answers might be. And one of the architects of 20th century Neo-Thomism is a fellow called Jacques Maritain. He's actually a Protestant, studies theology as a Protestant until the age of 24. And then either because of or soon after becoming a Catholic, he discovers Aquinas and becomes quite a Thomist. So again, he's not bred on Aquinas, discovers him on his own, which seems to be, you know, where people get their passion about Aquinas. And again, you know, comes to critique the kind of Protestantism that he'd been raised in heavily around this issue, that, you know, we must see God at work in the universe, God as part of the universe. There can't be this notion of the universe. Basically, he contends with the old Pythagorean Platonic worldview that, you know, there's this world of the gods up there and this world of the material down here. That his reading, particularly of the Judeo-Christian scriptures, is that it's talking about a God who is totally immersed, part of. There's no getting away from God, the Bonhoeffer's Lord of the world. And we are given, you know, through what Aristotle would describe as natural law, the senses by which we can know this God. Firstly, just by our sense of what's going on around us. We can trust these God-given intuitions, experiences, observations, experiments. In other words, we can do science and be religious at the same time. I mean, that's the great merger that comes with a Thomist view. And that it's through further reflection, and including on the scriptures, of course, that one comes to a full knowledge of the divine. So he pulls, if you like, the classical standoff Catholic view and the classical standoff Protestant view together, as was always there in Aquinas, that the Reformers missed and the Catholics at the time didn't have a clue. And we then have the synthesis, I guess, of revelation. It's not either or. It's not either, you know, we'll know God just through our senses, or we can only know God through the scriptures. They work together in Thomas's natural law to give us the full understanding of not just other, any other, not just the amorphous, anonymous God, but, you know, the God who's created me, who loves me, who will see me through, you know, to the end and take me to eternity, blah, blah. Maritain is one of the many architects of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, a theological consultant, philosophical and theological consultant. And he uses his sense of Thomistic natural law to influence that declaration, which is all about human rights, you know, natural human rights. People are born free. They're naturally inclined towards justice. They deserve a just world to live in. You know, also clearly an important kind of a response, I suppose, to Marxism in the form in which it's taken in certain regimes, in, you know, full-blown communism. And he is one of the influences, a very critical influence of Vatican II. He's present at Vatican II. He's one of the periti. He's one of the experts. He's one of the people who's helping to form the ideas. He's one of the theological touchstones. And he's bringing all of that Thomism in, which, you know, when you get antennas for Thomism, you see it tumbling out of those Vatican documents. Henri de Lubac, another one, he was part of a group that went by the tag of Nouvelle Theology, you know, a new kind of theology. It's not Catholic, it's not Protestant, it's not East, it's not West. It's not necessarily exclusively Christian. This is, you know, at the very least, Abrahamic theology. It's actually theology for the world. This is the kind of theology that can deal with the world the way it is, that can be part of the puzzle. We need to be in the debate. was the big tag. But only if theology adapts to the times. You know, there's no use staying with old theologies, be they Catholic, Protestant, Eastern, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, if they're just all about the past, if they're just preserving a block, if they're just, you know, fulfilling Bonhoeffer's critique of propping up, you know, local branch managers and local branch systems. We have to be out there dealing with the issues of the world, the problems of the world, the questions that people are asking, and not providing, you know, answers they haven't even, to questions they haven't even asked. He spoke a lot about the thing called covenantal theology for the Abrahamic people, characterised by the notion of God's covenant being with his people, really all people, but at the core of it, for the children of Abraham, the covenant that unites Judaism, Christianity and Islam, the people of the book or the people of the books. He's very strong on the fact that, you know, you Catholics, you've got to get away from the idea that scriptural analysis, biblical criticism is a Protestant thing that, you know, Catholics shouldn't take too seriously, or that it's a threat somehow or other to, you know, what props us up. That indeed all of the scriptures, certainly the Judeo-Christian scriptures, and implied the Islamic scriptures too, and that's a very interesting little link into, you know, some of the 21st century stuff that's starting to happen in and around Islamic scriptures, have to be subjected to modern hermeneutic method in order to understand their meaning. There's nothing to be frightened of here. This wasn't some Protestant reactionary thing. This is a healthy thing for any believer. Very strong in the notion that all people are the people of God. And again, you know, there was the great fear in the Roman Church about any notion like that, because it had been such a strong kind of a Lutheran notion, such a strong Reformation theme, that we, you know, some of the extreme ones particularly, that we shouldn't even have priesthoods, much less episcopacies and papacies, etc. But he grasps this one. It's part of his Nouvelle Theology. There can only be one. For the children of Abraham, the concept of people of God is so central to all of those three religions. And what he's saying to Christians is, you know, in a way the Jews and the Muslims have captured that one better than we have as Christians, any Christians, Catholic, Protestant, East, West. And you give this one away, you've given the whole game away. You give this one away in favour of the old pyramid popes, or indeed even, you know, Bible sitting at the top, overarching the people, subjecting the people to some sort of inferior existence, and you've lost the whole message that the Abrahamic tradition is about. And he talks very explicitly, he actually pulls this one straight out of Luther. If there's a legitimate priesthood, it's of all the faithful. That's the only legitimate Christian, priestly theology. It has to be of everyone. You know, go for castes and all that sort of stuff, well, you're off with some other religion. That's not Christian. It's not Abrahamic. It's a very prophetic kind of a theme. And de Lubac is also a theological expert at Vatican II. So you see the influence and the Thomist influence coming into Vatican II. Just for something quite different, Eric Mascal, better known as E.L. Mascal, he's actually an Anglican. Very interesting Anglican, very influential Anglican, you know, teaches at some of the most influential theological schools in England, and very much a Thomist. You know, never a Catholic, never, I mean, in actual fact, Mascal is coming through at a time when there's a reaction in Anglicanism against Catholicism, because in the late 19th century, the likes of John Henry Newman, you might have heard of, Cardinal Newman, who'd been part of this thing called the Oxford movement, because it all centred on Oxford, where Anglicanism and Catholicism were coming very close together, and then he went all the way, went to Rome, became a Catholic priest, eventually became a Catholic cardinal, and is now a blessed on the way to being a saint. That sort of frightened the horses a bit, and the other Anglicans said, hang on, we better not go too far that way. We didn't mean anyone to take it that seriously. So there was a bit of a pullback and a bit of a reaction, and Mascal's part of that. So he's no fan of Catholicism as such. Very much an Anglican, very much a reformed Anglican, believes in it all, but he carries his NEO-THOMISM through his Anglicanism. And he uses it to reach out, to do the big work that Thomas started to do in the 13th century, to reach out to Eastern Christianity. Mascal actually has done, put in place some bridging between East and West better than almost anyone has done, as well as to Judaism, as well as to Islam. Well before the time that it was fashionable to be doing these things, he's just putting his head to Thomas and saying, there's only one way forward. We can't be Christians in a box. Protestantism, Catholicism, East, West, Jew, Christian, Muslim, we are all children of Abraham. It's the only way forward. It's the only message that makes any sense. And he uses his NEO-THOMISM to analyse a whole set of matters of practicality for when the churches come together and how the churches can move through the 20th century, which is obviously of his prime concern, with some legitimacy, some validity, how they can deal with the real things that are bothering people, including things like common worship, which is a sticking point. How can Anglicans and Protestants and Easterners and Catholics all go to communion together? These sorts of things. He puts his head to that, works out ways in which that can happen, even well before it's an issue for anyone, including the Anglicans, deals with the issue of female priesthood. Not in a radical way, he's not a pro-woman priest, advocate as such. That's not what Aquinas does to you. Aquinas kind of slows you down, makes you careful, makes you go back to the fundamentals, make sure you got all the bits and pieces. You do the scientific thing. You don't go out on some raging campaign. So, at the end of the day, you wouldn't be dead sure just where Mascal sits personally on the issue of female priesthood. And again, this is way back in the 40s. He's writing about something that the Anglicans were 50 years away from. The Catholics, God knows how many years away from. But he just puts it all out there. And goes, what he's countering is the idiotic way in which an issue like that can be dealt with. Oh, Jesus didn't ordain women, so therefore we can never do it. I mean, how ridiculous, Jesus didn't ordain non-Jews. He didn't ordain non-fishermen. He didn't ordain people with short hair. He certainly didn't ordain people with clerical collars on. So, I mean, what's left? He just pulls it all out, puts it on the table, works it through in a Thomist scientific kind of a way, and basically at the end says, whatever people think, one day it's going to happen. Because that's where the world's moving. And there is no inherent reason why not. Not from his best scholarship. Scripturally, ontologically, ecclesiologically, whichever way you look at it, there is no inherent reason why it won't happen. And therefore, all in its good time, it will happen. And his work was one that had some influence on the Anglicans finally kind of making that move. He is an official kind of a non-Catholic, if you like, a Pariti of a sort. He's dubbed as an official commentator on Vatican II. And his commentary on Vatican II is quite fascinating. Bishop Butler, the Catholic bishop in England, commends him and suggests that his commentary is a salutary and humbling experience of seeing ourselves as others see us. So, as I say, it's Aquinas is not a preserve of Catholicism by any stretch, and becoming less and less and less so now. But Rana is Catholic. Probably, I guess in most people's estimation, the most significant Catholic theologian of the 20th century. The two Karls, Rana and Barth, they kind of bring up the two sides. They are the two big chiefs in many, many ways of Protestantism and Catholicism in the 20th century. He's part of the group, Nouvelle Theology. Some of his more contentious kinds of findings, and I think with Rana you'd have to call them findings because he's as thoroughgoing as well, not probably as thoroughgoing as Aquinas, but no one is. He's thoroughgoing. He doesn't say anything lightly. And this was one of the more contentious, I suppose, of his findings, that Protestant and Catholic Christianity are really equally valid forms of Christianity, just different. And that's something, the whole Western Church has to deal with. There has to be a whole lot of honesty about why and how the Reformation happened. And the scandal, if you like, of a divided, fractured, fighting with itself kind of a church can't persist. Everybody kind of has to come to the table with a fresh mind on this, and accept the equality and the validity of each other. I mean, an issue that one would have to say we're further away from now than probably, for a long time. He continues very much Aquinas' work in reaching out to the East, reaching out to other religions, and even to non-believers. He has this phrase, anonymous Christianity, that to me rings again of Bonhoeffer. If you see people actually doing the things that you call Christian, you see people who call themselves Christian doing things that you don't regard as Christian, well, if God's anywhere, where is he? Or, where's the Spirit working? With the people who just say, oh yes, we're Christians, we're doing all the right thing, but clearly their actions are at odds, as against those who have no pretense. They don't need the language. They might even call themselves atheists, but you see them actually doing the things that you associate with Christian action. So, kind of, where's God? Who's going to be saved if there's choices to be made? He gets into that sort of territory. Christianity, at the end of the day, is a way of living more than a religious thing. Again, rather Bonhoefferian. Perhaps some of his more dangerous work is actually, again, exploring the Nicene categories. Anyone who gets into it can see that that's where the whole East-West split started, when the Roman Church got on its high horse and promulgated, as a front to propping up its own power, and then kind of, just went away to look after itself rather than worrying about the wider Christian thing. And as a result of it, even opening up and even asking the questions at different times, Rana's been accused of being a monophysitist rather than a duophysitist, a one nature of Christ person rather than a two nature of Christ person. And, believe it or not, even of Arianism, just keeps on coming back like the great echo through history. Rana was lucky in some ways to be just in the right place at the right time. He was clearly under great suspicion in the run-up, to the council, and if he was around today, I think most of us would have no doubt that he'd be having his books, banned and burnt or whatever the hell. And again, like so many of the others, stresses that the Abrahamic thing is the inherent link. It has to be the least that anyone who calls themselves Christian accepts that we are bound in that Abrahamic triad in a way that we can't legitimately get out of. We are children of Abraham at the very least. That's the least kind of Christian position. The greater Christian position, of course, is this, seeing that non-Abrahamic folk and even those explicitly called non-believers are also, caught up in this Lord of the world. And his, as it's been dubbed often, radical Thomism also has a clear influence on Vatican II, and he's present there as well. I think we might go straight on to you-know-who.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
If you want to watch on My Study Rana, and that is Karen.
Yeah, and I recommend that too. It's a great little YouTube with her explaining some of the fundamentals of Rana's thought. There's a moral theologian called Richard McCormick who's now deceased, and he said one of the chief consequences of reading Rana is a nagging headache, not because the content itself is bad, but because he writes in this funny sort of circular, very meditative kind of way, and sometimes it takes you about 10 pages to figure out what the idea he's getting at there is. Some say that was deliberate to confuse the people who might be investigating him. So you never know. What I might do, because we're coming up to, probably got 10 or 12 minutes left, I'll go through the next theologian we're going to look at, and I'll put an announcement up online with some guidelines about the final assessment task. So they'll be up by tomorrow morning, and you'll all be welcome to contact me, Terry or Mike, with further clarifications if you need them via email. Is that okay? Okay, so the next, that's that YouTube link, by the way. The next theologian is an important 20th century Roman Catholic theologian. It's been good to see the spread of 20th century theologians. But he's a theologian which many of you would know already, and some of you are about to find out becomes even more important for a number of reasons in the 21st century. And we'll get into that as we go along. His name is Joseph Ratzinger, and so a prolific author, someone who has written a lot and doesn't mind writing a lot. Last count, over 100 books and over 400 scholarly articles. And a real scholar too. I mean, this is someone who knows languages, knows all the biblical languages, can engage in dialogue with biblical scholars, systematic theologians, scientists on some occasions too. So quite a brilliant mind. He's born in Bavaria. Those of you who know anything about Germany know that Bavaria is the most conservative part of Germany. Some of the stories go around that you have to ask permission to basically do anything in Bavaria. I don't know if that extends as far as going down to the local coffee shop or not. But certainly for anything you want to do around your house, everything's highly regulated in Bavaria. He's born in 1927 as well, which those of you who are philosophy buffs would know that is the year that Martin Heidegger publishes his work, Sein und Zeit, Being and Time, which was to become, in continental Europe anyway, one of the most important philosophical works of the 20th century. He really changed the direction of philosophy in many ways. Those of you who know Dr. Tim Stanley here at Newcastle, his PhD thesis had a lot to do with Martin Heidegger. And he influences the thought of someone like Karl Rahner. So when you read Rahner, you get a sense that he's influenced by Martin Heidegger. Pope John Paul II was influenced by Martin Heidegger. So a very important year philosophically, but a diverse. In order to understand someone's theology, it's always good to give a bit of background to their background. Ratzinger is born into a very conservative and devotional Catholic family. One of the stories is that they used to go to church 3 times on a Sunday. It was the highlight of their week. And he often talks about, in his theology, in his more personal reflections, what a great moment this was for him. It gave structure to life for him. It was the moment of beauty in an otherwise perhaps dull week. So he has this great love for that very devotional kind of Roman Catholicism, and a simple Catholicism in many ways, until he goes on to become a very important theologian. He's unwillingly conscripted into the Nazi youth. So as a German, 1927, coming up to the Second World War there, he's conscripted as a young man into the Nazi youth. He never sees battle. He's never on the front line. But he is one of the kind of supporting members of the Nazi Party. But it is important to emphasise that unwillingness. Himself, actually, after the war, becomes very briefly a prisoner of war. There's a story that he was marched along an autobahn with a lot of other German soldiers in the uniform and then put in one of the camps for a brief period of time. It has a very interesting effect on him. Unlike some of the other theologians you've been discussing and will be discussing perhaps even in that major essay, he seems to distance himself from this event of the Holocaust. Not in the sense that he doesn't see it as important, but it becomes a kind of critical distance, a coldness towards it. When he discusses it, it's almost in analytic terms. You might see that sometimes when people have a horrible experience, they tend to do that. They step back a bit and they see it from the outside almost and see it in a cold way. It makes it a bit easier to deal with. So certainly when he speaks about that, and he continues to speak about that time, sometimes he gets himself in a bit of trouble because he does look at it analytically and the emotion isn't as obviously there. Like Rana and some of the others we've talked about, he's a praetus or expert at the Second Vatican Council, and he's very, very important at the Second Vatican Council. A lot of church historians, the people that Mike's been talking about, would say it's hard to underestimate his influence at the Second Vatican Council. So you can see this is a theologian who has influence. He's influential in the composition of two documents, one of which Mike spoke about earlier, which is that Lumen Gentium, light to the world. Notice the use of "to" there. There's another document we'll talk about in a minute, which Mike touched on as well. With Eve Congar, we don't speak about Eve Congar in the lectures, but in your reading outline for this week, it asks you to go to a book called 20th Century Theologians and choose a couple. And Eve Congar is one of the chapters of that book, so you might like to have a look at them. Dave Verbum as well, English title literally, Word of God, translating that Latin there, but the English title is The Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, with our friend Karl Rahner, who we just talked about. So here's someone who can dialogue critically and build work up with other theologians as well. But he becomes very uneasy towards the end of the council and after it. So towards the end of the council, he sees some loose ends. You know, that German critical thought, which is always looking at tidying up loose ends. He sees some loose ends in some of the documents, and he starts to become aware that, you know, people might misinterpret these things. They might take these things too far. And indeed, after the council, he starts to see what he thinks are real misinterpretations of the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. People are taking all this too far. You know, we need to get back to our roots a bit more, and that becomes a consistent motive in his theology. Sorry that I'm rushing through this, but it's good just to get this overview, because you'll remember he was born in Bavaria, and his whole theology can almost be seen in this direction, moving from Bavaria into the Second Vatican Council, and he becomes a professor at a university in Germany called Tübingen. We've got a good friend who studied in Tübingen. She's now an ordained Lutheran minister in Germany. But he's there in a very important time, and this is the 1960s, the late 1960s, more specifically still 1968, in which a lot of important things happen for Christian theology. One of them is that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. It's a very important, well, I don't know if important's the right word, but it's a defining point for Roman Catholic teaching on sexual ethics. And if you're interested in following that up, all you need to do is type into Google 1968 Catholic Church, and I guarantee you what I've indicated there will come up. And it's also the year that in Tübingen University, there's a big body of student protests that starts, and it's Marxist-influenced student protests. And one of the cries of these students walking into theology lectures, and these are how the stories go, the big groups of students rattle Ratzinger's lectures, and Hans Kung, another theologian who's working there at the time, go into their lectures and in very Marxist language say things like, the church has been not in solidarity with the poor, but has been sympathising with the ruling class, has been sympathising with management, whatever you want to call them, the governing class, and has been, as such, complicit with abusing the poor, keeping the poor down the bottom there. And this really shocks Ratzinger very deeply as a theologian. He's very concerned about what these people are accusing the church of, the church that he grew up with and he knows and he loves so well. He finds this very distressing, these accusations. And he actually returns. He has to leave Tübingen after a while. Even Hans Kung at the end of his lectures, they're very different characters, these two. The end of Hans Kung's lectures for the semester has to actually shut them down because it's becoming too difficult to lecture with all these student protests going on. But Ratzinger actually leaves Tübingen and goes to another university, and the name escapes me now, but it's much closer to his home Bavaria. So you can see this leaving Bavaria, going out, Second Vatican Council, Tübingen, and then back in that direction again. With a few of the people we've talked about, de Lubac, Walter Kasper, we've mentioned here and there, and another fellow called Hans Urs von Balthasar. He starts a journal called Communio after the council when he sees that, he thinks people are taking this a bit far, they're interpreting this the wrong way. He sees a need to draw it back in a little bit. And with these guys, he starts a journal called Communio. And that's the whole point of the journal, to try and draw things back in a bit. It's what you'd call a much more conservative journal. Not necessarily in opposition to, but there's another journal that starts at the same time called Concilium, which one of the chief editors is Karl Rahner. So you can see that their thought is splitting in this way, a journal which is much more interested in revolutionising theology, doing things in a new way. In 1981, he's appointed to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which Mike spoke about earlier, and he's one of the principal authors of the document that you saw earlier that Mike put up, criticising liberation theology. So what the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith does now is really charged with the task of, from Rome's perspective, clarifying theological matters. And a large part of that is looking at what theologians teaching in Catholic institutions around the world are saying or writing under the banner of Catholicism, and saying this is orthodox, this isn't. So its concern is really orthodoxy, two Greek words which mean right teaching. As part of that, he goes into, and the theologian Mike mentioned earlier before, is one of them. The other one is a fellow named Leonardo Boff, who in his own liberation theology starts to use Marxist language very explicitly. So he'll say things like, we as the church have to have solidarity with the people on the bottom, with the working class. That's where we need to be, and challenge the authorities that be. In Ratzinger's mind, you can hear how this would be ringing alarm bells of student protests back in Tübingen. So he's very hard on Leonardo Boff, and eventually he gets his permission to teach within a Catholic institution revoked. So this is a very powerful group, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Other people that they go after are Hans Kung is one, the moral theologian Charles Curran, for all sorts of reasons. He also oversees the development of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is published in the 1990s. Again, his emphasis is on clarity here. We need better clarity for people so that they know what orthodoxy means. And he publishes a very contentious document under the banner of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So he's not the only author there. It's a group of people called Dominus Jesus, which has huge influence on how the Roman Catholic Church would go about ecumenism. So again, that'd be one to Google if you're interested in that. And if you're wondering why I say he's become a very influential theologian today, is in 2005 he's elected as the Bishop of Rome, and you probably know him better as Pope Benedict XVI. He's still a theologian though. Elected as Pope, he's still a theologian, and he still writes theology books. He released a book a couple of years ago called Jesus of Nazareth, and in the front cover he says this is a theologian's book. This isn't a Pope's book as such. It's not a work of the magisterium, and it can be critiqued by theologians. And as a theologian, you can see his own theology come out in what he says, how he leads the Roman Catholic Church, and in what he writes as well. So very quickly, gosh, the time gets away quickly. His theology is a theology born out of frustration with the dryness he saw in neo-scholasticism. So it's fascinating that you get this real tension here. On the one hand, people are finding neo-scholasticism liberating and new and fresh. But on the other hand, it's being taught in such a way to some people that they just can't see the value of it. In our now familiar tension between Augustine and Aquinas, Ratzinger firmly sides with Augustine, and he's not afraid to say that. He says quite explicitly in some points that he found so much life in Augustine, but when he read Aquinas, he just really didn't see much there for him. It was too hard to get to. And then you see all the familiar things we've been talking about throughout the semester come through in terms of Augustinian thought. I put up the little island there. One great theologian called Avery Dulles described Ratzinger and some of the other cardinals who were present at a 1985 conference as if they saw the church as this beautiful island of paradise in the midst of a world which was all corrupted and sinful. You can hear the Augustinian overtones there, and also the Platonic ones as well. He emphasises above all truth, and you'll hear this come through in different Catholic circles today, this emphasis on truth. They'll often ask that question, what's the truth here? Or they'll say something like, we've got the truth. I had a conversation with a conservative Catholic friend once, and it was something to do with ecumenism. I just remember her last remarks was something like, oh, well, it doesn't matter what they believe. We've got the truth. So this is a very Augustinian, Platonic kind of look on things. It's a truth that's external to the human condition. Unlike a Rana who would say something like, or an Aquinas who'd say something like, when the human person is living the good life, living according to what it means to be truly human, that's the good life, that's what's true, that's what's good. This understanding of truth is not an interior truth. It's not something that one looks inwards for. It's something that comes from the outside. And those of you who have studied Plato would know that great metaphor is probably his most well-known metaphor of the cave. You know, because this world is so corrupt and things are wrong with it, we don't really have access to perfect truth. We just see shadows as if we're in a cave. The light's actually outside. And the good philosopher for Plato stands outside in the light, but finds it very difficult to explain it to everybody left back inside the cave that this isn't reality. Reality is something else. That's very much the Ratzinger look on things. God is truth, and because of this fallen human condition, we just don't know what that truth is. So we have to get away from ourselves almost to stand in the light. And he talks about eros, the great Greek word eros is one of the many words for love, as a drive towards that what is exterior, that truth that's outside us. And one of his encyclicals picks up on that point very strongly, Deus Caritas Est. You can get these for free online as well if you just type them into Google, so it might be worth reading up on them. It contrasts with Rana quite dramatically here, but it also has implications for the way in which problems are dealt with. I mean, he's head of the Roman Church now, and the Roman Church is facing serious problems in some areas. A Thomistic approach would tend to look for clues in how to solve these in the world. You know, what are the social sciences telling us about why people aren't signing up for the priesthood anymore, for example? What are psychologists telling us? What can we learn by looking at this situation critically? Whereas Ratzinger's approach will tend to be more like, we need to get back to the truth of things. Once we purify our theology, once we get our approach to Scripture right, once we make the liturgy, more authentic, the other things will fall into place. That's the most dramatic. I mean, look at the different worldviews. So he sees the sciences in a bit of an ambivalent way. He's certainly supportive of them, but he's a bit ambivalent about them. I suppose just to finish with the Augustinian heritage there, there's very much this tension between a heavenly, and this is in the work of Augustine itself, a heavenly city and an earthly city. And it's no secret that Ratzinger really sees the church as the heavenly city, and there are a lot of theological reasons for this. But one finds truth not out there in the world, not by going into the world, but by being a part of the church. One comes into communion with God by being a part of the church. And so therefore he sees things like philosophy and science as okay, they're important, but they need to be purified. This is very much his theology of purification. Things need to be purified in the light of faith. He's pessimistic about human abilities considered on their own. And that goes back to the Augustinian understanding of original sin. And that document that Mike mentioned there, Gaudium et Spes, he's very critical of that as well. For him, it's too optimistic. The church in the world, it gives a bit too much to the world. And he says it leaves us a bit more ambivalent. What have we got to offer if that's how we see things? So just to end, and for the online folks, I thought this is a very interesting picture, and I came across it, I can't quite remember where anymore. I didn't put it in the PowerPoint because of copyright reasons, but the link's there online. But it's a fascinating look from the top, I suppose. So I'll leave you with that, and I will put that assignment information up online by tomorrow morning. So thank you very much. One more week to go. We'll see you then.